Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Ada Ferrer, and she has just published a book on September 7th, 2021. Title of the book is Cuba, An American History. It has excellent reviews on Amazon, well-deserved, and a really fascinating book. I learned so much about Cuban history and really how it is affected by the U.S. So we can talk more about that. But Dr. Ferrer is the Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin American and Caribbean History at New York University. She is the beneficiary of a 2018 Guggenheim Fellowship. She also has won many book prizes. One is the 2015 Frederick Douglass Book Prize for the best book on slavery, and also another prize from the 2015 Frederick Catt Prize for the best book in Latin American history, and also the 2015 Wesley Logan Prize for the best book on the African diaspora from the AHA. So she's won many prizes for her books. Some of the earlier titles, one from 2005 is Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution, 1868 to 1898. And also in 2014, Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution. But again, we're going to talk about this book she just published. Again, title is Cuba, An American History. So Dr. Ferrer, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who might not have heard your background, can you talk about your personal life and your academic career and what led you to write this fascinating book, Cuba, An American History?
Sure. Well, I was born in Cuba, and my mother and I left in 1963. And I grew up in a place that was mostly Cuban immigrants, Cuban refugees. And so I grew up hearing stories about Cuba all the time, living with the reality of family separation. My mother had left my brother behind on the island. And, it was an obsession for a lot of people around me. So I kind of began to share that obsession and became interested in understanding it. What was this place where I had been born, but couldn't remember? And so in 1990, I went back to the island for the first time. And I met my family, I saw where I was born, and I began doing research in libraries and archives on Cuban history. And so since 1990, I've been traveling back almost every year, sometimes more than once a year, and always doing all those things. Most of my, the day-to-day, Monday through Friday, is usually sitting in an archive or a library, looking through old documents. And then on weekends or evenings, I see family and friends I've made over the years. So I've come to know the island well as, in a way as a kind of, as part of who I am, but then I've also come to know it well as an object of study. And I think it has a fascinating history for many reasons. One reason is the links to the US, which you alluded to in passing. And I wrote this book now, in part because I feel like Americans don't know this history, and they don't know how much of a shared history the two countries have. And I think, policy policy, diplomacy, travel, everything works better when people are better informed.
I would definitely agree with that. And I agree that a lot of Americans don't know this past history of Cuba and how much the U.S. has really eyed Cuba, and how they've cross-fertilized, the peoples and culture have cross-fertilized each other. I don't know if they know how much so to such a degree. Can you talk about really what the beginnings of Cuba, the Spanish kind of, and going back to Christopher Columbus, and how Cuba developed as an independent entity?
Yeah. So Cuba, as you said, was a Spanish colony. Columbus landed there for the first time in 1492 and encountered a fascinating indigenous culture. We came to call those people the Taínos, and the majority of them died as a result of the conquest, but parts of their culture survived, the language, some of the music, and so on. And for a long time in the colonial period, because the Spanish began in the Caribbean, but then they went on to places like Mexico and the Andes, which had large, very organized indigenous empires, and which had plentiful supplies of gold and silver. So the Spanish focused on those places because they could get, more profit from them. And Cuba became, in some ways, a kind of backwater. People preferred to go to wealthier, richer places. So Havana in particular, which sits right where the Gulf Stream kind of gathers, became a place that the Spanish used as a kind of home for treasure fleets. So all those ships, the Spanish Armada that would, go back and forth carrying gold and silver, all of them met in Havana and then did the transatlantic journey together. So Havana from the start, and Cuba from the start, became kind of a place oriented outwards, a place meant to serve the colony, meant to serve the metropole Spain. And it wasn't until, so that pattern persists, but the main thing that the island became in the colonial period was a slave society. So a society based on the enslavement of Africans and their descendants, most of whom were brought to the island to harvest sugar, to plant and harvest sugar. So, and that, that characteristic of the island it took shape really at the end of the 18th century and the 19th century.
Right. So, I mean, it was interesting, some of the statistics that you cite in your book. There really weren't that many people in Cuba at that time, whereas there's whole histories of Hernan Cortez and Pizarro and all this stuff, but it became a way spent. So even these kind of words like Armada and Tiburon came from this colonization and the subsequent thing. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, words like shark, like shark or hurricane, right? These were things that they hadn't known in Spain or Europe. So they used the indigenous words for them. And now they're, hurricane the word hurricane in English has its roots in a Taino word. So
yeah, and I thought that was one great aspect of your book, is like you emphasize that there were indigenous people here. Maybe some of the other histories of this time did not acknowledge or emphasize them as much as you did. So I credit you for that. But can you talk about how from Havana and this area, how the kind of growth in the sugar industry and the slave trade grew in Cuba?
Yeah. Well, sugar was there from the start. Columbus had brought a sugarcane cutting on, I think it was his second voyage to the New World. So there's evidence of sugar from that time. But it really takes off, as I said, at the end of the 18th century. And one of the major reasons it does so then is what we know of as the Haitian Revolution. So the Haitian Revolution occurred in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is very close. It's the island that today has Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And at the time, the French colony of Saint-Domingue was the wealthiest colony in the world. I mean, wealthiest for the people who owned it and the people who held slaves. So it produced most of the sugar consumed across the world, and its planters were, wealthy, happy men. When the Haitian Revolution happened and the enslaved people rose up in rebellion, and that sugar industry began to very, very quickly decline. And the Cuban planters realized that this for them was an opportunity. So they said, okay. And one of them, a very prominent, important one, said, the hour of our happiness has arrived. And so they set about winning concessions from the Spanish crown and really developing what became then the most important sugar industry in the world in the 19th century. And it's at that point that the arrival of Africans from in the holds of slave vessels really took off as well. So that happened as a direct response to the Haitian Revolution.
Right. And that also was kind of one of the earlier ties with the colonies, or kind of America, early U.S., where they were involved in that slave trade, bringing some of these African slaves to Cuba. And I think you point out in your book, like, there was always an acknowledgement among the Cubans, maybe the Spaniard Cubans, of Haiti and their relations. And it started very early, the race relations in Cuba, and how many African Americans there were. So they were always kind of concerned about something of what happened in Haiti and Cuba could happen in Cuba, correct?
Right, absolutely. And the Spanish used that to really good effect. So, in the early 19th century, almost every colony of Spain became independent. So you look at Mexico, Peru, Argentina, they all became independent in the 1820s mostly, and Cuba didn't. And one reason was that the planters, the elite planters, didn't want to risk a revolution as it happened in Haiti. So they decided to stick with Spain. And Spain basically kept saying, if you try to become independent, another Haiti will happen. So it was used for conservative political purposes to keep the island a colony of Spain and to maintain slavery.
Right. I think you quoted like there was for that time, an immense amount of trade, 270,000 slaves in 30 years, right there at the early 19th century. So significant amount. And also there was another kind of industry that took place in Cuba. Can you talk about the copper ore industry and the Virgin of Charity and how that's kind of an important cultural figure?
Yeah. So that's earlier. So Cuba's a very long island. If you laid it on its side, it would go from about where New York City is to about where Savannah, Georgia is, right? And the terrain changes. In the east, there are beautiful mountains. I think they rise about 3,000 meters above sea level. And in the colonial period, from the 16th century on, there were deposits of copper. And there was a mining company that had enslaved workers mine the copper. One of the things that happens, and it's so, every Cuban knows the figure of the Virgin of Charity. She's the island's patron saint. In Spanish, it would be the Caridad del Cobre, the charity of copper. And so you ask a Cuban in Cuba, you ask a Cuban in Miami, anywhere, they will know her figure. Many will have a little statue of her in their home, as I do, and as our family home did growing up. But many Cubans don't realize that the reason, the devotion to her as a figure, and the longevity of her cult, you would say, is due to the fact that those enslaved miners really committed themselves to her. So she was their patron saint before she was the nation's patron saint. So the story that is seen as a kind of national cultural story is really tied to the institution of slavery and to the history of Black Cubans on the island.
And it kind of reminded me of what happened in Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe, that same type of character very early on that still pervades the culture to this day.
Right.
And so you had this kind of very early on, you had these conflicts. And even like during the colonial time, Havana and Cuba got involved in the 7-Year War. Can you talk about how the U.S. or really it was the British Empire influenced and affected Cuba from that early period?
Yeah. So the 7 Years War, sometimes, when I studied it in school here in the U.S., we knew it as the French and Indian War, right? Where it was a, dispute between the French and the British over land in North America, in the north mostly. But really it was a war that involved most of Europe, and Spain, and Britain declared war on Spain. And one of the things that it decided to do was to attack and seize Havana. Havana had this reputation for being a wealthy city, in part because it had this long history of serving as the place where the Spanish stored their silver and where the treasure fleets always were. So people said that silver coins flowed in Havana as if they were, rivers. And so a lot of European monarchs liked the idea of acquiring Havana, and the British during the 7 Years War decided they would do that. So they attack in 1762, and it's the siege lasts weeks because they can't take it. And finally, what helps the British take it is the arrival of troops from North America, from places like Connecticut and Rhode Island and New York, etc. And so they defeat the Spanish, and Havana becomes British territory for about 10 months. So it becomes part of the same empire as the 13 colonies. And during those 10 months, you have North American merchants just kind of descend and all over, the city. They kind of take over, bringing their products and taking out sugar and other things to sell in the 13 colonies. So it's a period where the commercial relations between the 13 colonies and Havana get really drawn close together. In the end, when the treaty all the parties signed a treaty to end the war, and Britain gives up Havana for Florida. So
Gotcha.
yeah, and that's I say in the book that's the first time that the fates of Havana and Florida were intertwined, but it's not the last time.
Right. So it goes all the way back.
Yeah.
And also the relations before the U.S. became the U.S., the relations between Cuba and the colonies were very strong economically. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And that's really becomes really important during the American Revolution. We're taught to appreciate the French role in the American Revolution. Lafayette and Rochambeau and others who provided assistance to Washington and others, but the Spanish also provided a lot of help, and a lot of that help was funneled through Havana. So during the American Revolution, the Spanish let the colonists trade in Havana freely, and it's where they got a lot of the silver currency that then served as the foundation of the Americans' first central bank, the First National Bank. A Spanish officer in Havana collected silver that was sent to George Washington and Lafayette right before the Battle of Yorktown. And it was that money that was used to pay George Washington's troops, who hadn't been paid in a long time. So the Cuban assistance and the Spanish assistance was also part of the story of the American Revolution.
Right. And there was actually kind of a figure, kind of like the French Lafayette or something, Miralles, I think.
Yeah, Miralles. Yeah, he was quite a character. Yeah.
So when Washington's having he's happy to see this emissary. So he was very sensitive about the contact, him and the growing country and Cuba and its representatives.
Right. Yeah.
And so, it continues. The U.S. becomes a country, and there's always a tension in Cuba between the system of slavery and its people maintaining slavery. Can you talk about how some of those conflicts manifested themselves?
Yeah. So, slavery is was a powerful and profitable institution. And that was true in the U.S. It was true in Cuba as well. One of the things that's really important there's several things that you can note about slavery in Cuba. One is that, as I said before, it's always tied to the cultivation of sugar. So you can follow, for instance, the rise of sugar in Cuba, and you can see the deforestation of the island follow. So the sugar boom first happens around Havana, in the hinterland around Havana, and little by little it goes eastward, and you see the forests fall all the way. So it's a way of kind of tracing Cuban history. And with each region sugar enters, you can see a different relationship with the U.S. So, for example, one of the most interesting places is east of Havana, the province of Matanzas. It's also a city, Matanzas, and next door is a city called Cárdenas. In the 19th century, those cities had so many American plantation owners. So there were Americans there who owned plantations, who the Americans provided the sugar equipment that processed the raw sugar cane. Americans built a lot of the railroads that took the sugar to port. And as you mentioned before, Americans were involved in the illegal slave trade that brought, captive laborers to work the sugar. And that, so many things, I feel like that region is kind of just exemplifies the growing links between Cuba and the U.S. in that mid-19th century period. And it shows the extent to which the link was built on slavery. So, for example, I have, there's one figure, his name was James DeWolf. He was a wealthy U.S. senator from Rhode Island, and he was also he was a slave trader, or he had been a slave trader, and he and his family owned 4 plantations in Cuba. And then he used the profits from those plantations to invest in other industries, and in back home, in the Northeast. So that's one example. There's a U.S. vice president. This is one of my favorite stories in the book. There's a U.S. vice president, William Rufus King, who was vice president to Franklin Pierce, elected in 1853. And he actually took his oath of office on a Cuban sugar plantation in the middle of harvest season. So he became U.S. vice president while he stood on a Cuban sugar plantation. I mean, it's just remarkable. I read that the first time and couldn't believe it. I had to read it and reread it and reread it to make sure that it was true. But it's kind of a symbol of how closely intertwined those systems were. And it's also a sign of the fact that the U.S. and U.S. leaders always had this political interest in Cuba and in the possibility of acquiring Cuba and making it part of the U.S.
Right. So Adams, and you state in your book, Adams and Jefferson are talking about it, saying that it would be a good addition. But it was also curious to me, too, is that the Cuban elite also at that time had a desire to become part of the new U.S. Is that true?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So, Adams and Jefferson and Madison, Monroe, they clearly did. And they would talk about how acquiring Cuba would help them kind of fill out the true destiny of the new American nation. They thought it would help protect their commerce, establish their power in a wider world, etc. In terms of the Cuban elite was always tied to slavery and sugar. And they saw, Spain was weakening. Spain had already lost the rest of its colonies in South America. And they thought of Spain as weak in 2 ways. One is that they didn't trust that Spain would stand up to Britain. And Britain in this moment is becoming increasingly vigilant and militant against the slave trade. So they thought that the Spanish elite might acquiesce to Britain and really crack down on the slave trade and on slavery. And the elite, the Cuban elite, feared that. So they saw the U.S. as kind of a possible savior because the U.S. was increasingly powerful and it was completely committed to slavery. So they thought, in a sense, that they could protect their investments, their stake in slavery and sugar by allying themselves with the U.S.
Right. So you saw, this kind of view. People are in exile in New York City at that time. I think it was Felix Varela, or it's one of these early people, even before Martí, was still influencing people in the U.S. about Cuba at that time. But can you talk about how the Monroe Doctrine kind of influenced the relations between Cuba and the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, the Monroe Doctrine became U.S. policy in 1823. And the basic idea behind it is that the U.S. was stating for the world that no European power could colonize or recolonize Latin America. So basically, it's a way of kind of declaring the hemisphere free of any European colonization. But the Monroe Doctrine also recognized that, places like, there were a few places that were still European colonies, namely Cuba and Puerto Rico. So the policy basically said, no, that's fine. We're not going to kick Spain out, but no one else can come in and take those places. So what it did is it in theory, it kept Europe out of Latin America and out of Cuba, but really it was designed as a policy meant to keep meant to check British influence and British power in the hemisphere. And in the case of Cuba, that's what they most feared. The American leaders did not think that Cubans could win their own independence, Or they thought if Cubans managed to win their own independence, the elite would likely ally with the US. So what the Americans feared was that the British would take Cuba and then end the slave trade and eventually end slavery. And then they would lose, then the US would lose those connections, which they didn't want to do.
And you devote one chapter, torture plots, to kind of this growing resistance by African slaves. Can you talk about how that was addressed by the Cuban elite, and how kind of like you talked about earlier, some of these English or UK influenced people also were trying to motivate to overthrow slavery?
Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting about slavery is that wherever you find the institution of slavery, you will find enslaved people trying to do battle in one way or another against it, whether that's by running away or by resisting and trying to limit the work they do, or feigning illness, or in some instances rebelling. So you have rebellions, and you have runaway slave communities in Cuba. You have rebellions almost from the very beginning. So there's two rebellions, slave rebellions, that I talk about in the book. Even before the one in that chapter, I talk about one led by a man named Jose Antonio Aponte. Aponte was a free black man in Havana, a carpenter and an artist, and he organized this large rebellion against slavery and against the Spanish. The rebellion was quashed. They after attacking 3 plantations, the rebels were caught and captured and tried. And Aponte was captured and brought to trial. And it's one of the things that makes it so interesting is that Aponte was also an artist. So he had a book that he had made that he called the Book of Paintings. And the Book of Paintings was full of all kinds of interesting things. And he would show it to the recruits in the movement to help them kind of imagine a world without slavery, to help them imagine a Black revolution. The authorities found the book, confiscated it, and made him describe every image in the book. And then they hanged him. And then the book disappeared. And so all we have are his descriptions. So I write about that one. I think that's a fascinating example. And I may write more about that at some point. And then the other one, which you just mentioned, is one that unfolds precisely in Matanzas, the region I mentioned before, in 1843 and 1844, where you just have a series of one rebellion and one conspiracy after another in this relatively small region. And one of the things that's interesting about that movement is that it was both urban and rural. There were enslaved people involved on sugar plantations and coffee plantations, but there were also free men of color from the cities. You had musicians. You had one of the most prominent people was a man named Plácido, who was a poet, and he was one of the leaders and executed for his role. And also British abolitionists were involved, and that's one of the reasons the Americans feared them. So there were some British abolitionists who worked with the rebels and the conspirators. But ultimately, what the Spanish did is it defeated one rebellion after another, one conspiracy after another, and it engaged in very brutal torture against people suspected or captured, where people were tied to a ladder and then whipped, which is why the whole series is called La Escalera being ladder. And one of the results of both those rebellions and conspiracies and the repression by Spain is that it really decimated the free community of color, free Blacks who had been artists and poets and musicians and so on. So many of them were killed, many of them were banished and forcibly removed from the island. So it kind of struck terror in the heart of enslaved people, and also in the heart of this free Black community that was upwardly mobile and that was sympathetic to the idea of independence. And for the Spanish, it kind of helped them prove the point of how dangerous any kind of movement could be, right? That if they wanted independence, well, they might end up with a slave rebellion. So the Spanish used it to that end.
Right, and you call like the peace that happened the tranquility of terror. So it wasn't like a happy
Yeah.
peace at all. And I mean, it just kind of led to farther. I thought it was interesting that after the American Civil War, so many of these Beauregard and these other characters came to Cuba. So it's just an additional tie between the two countries.
Right.
Can you talk about the importance of Jose Marti and kind of talk about the 10 Years' War and how that developed?
Yeah. So the Cuban independence movement, which I think the world doesn't know enough about. that's my own sense. It's a fascinating movement. The first war begins in 1868 and it lasts 10 years. So that's the 10 Years' War. And there would be another war shortly after, which is called the Little War from 1879 to 1880. Then there's a longer period of peace in which there's a lot of mobilization in favor of independence. And the final war of independence takes place from 1895 to 1898. So really, it's a 30-year process of fighting for and mobilizing and advocating for independence from Spain. There are there are many things one can say about that movement. I'll just point out two. One is that the wars on the Cuban side were waged by a new institution, which the rebels called the Army of Liberation, or the Liberation Army. And it was a popular fighting force. Many enslaved people and formerly enslaved people joined. Black men had joined and also, ascended through the ranks. So some of the most important figures were themselves men of color. The most famous is a man named Antonio Maceo, who was at the time very well known in the U.S., especially African Americans, who in many cases named their sons after him. So they didn't name them. They named them Maceo, but in English they pronounced it Maceo. So that was a common African American name in the late 19th and early 20th century. So that's one thing that's interesting about the movement. The other thing is that because it unfolds alongside the end of slavery, right? In the first war, the leaders abolished slavery in rebel territory. So from the start, the movement is linked to the question of slavery and to the question of race. And it develops this powerful argument against the Spanish. Now, forever, and Spain and its allies had said Cuba can't be independent, because if it tries to become independent, you will get a race war, you will get another Haiti, et cetera, et cetera. And what the independence movement did was to completely disavow that argument and say, no, we've had this war. And Black men and white men fought together side by side. And the republic we are building will not have slavery, and it will stand against racial warfare and racial inequality and discrimination, et cetera. So it developed a language that of racial equality and anti-racism that was very novel and powerful in a society that was only, 9 years past slavery. Slavery ended in Cuba in 1886. So that was really interesting. And one of the figures who most espoused these ideas was the figure of Jose Marti, who you just asked me about. And Jose Marti was the son of, he was white, he was the son of Spaniards. He was arrested by the Spanish early on in the 10 Years' War and exiled to Spain. He came back briefly, but then, was arrested again. He realized there was no way for him to live in Cuba, that he would be arrested and likely executed. So he did what so many other people did when they're seeking refuge. He came to the US and he came to New York City. And so he lived more of his adult life in New York City than anywhere else.
Right, like 15 years, right?
Yeah, because he died, in 1895 in the first war. So he didn't have a long adult life, and most of it, more of it was lived here in New York, which is where I am, than in Cuba. And he's a fascinating figure. He's, he made a living here as a writer, as a clerk. He used to write scenes about American life that he would publish in newspapers across Latin America. And he would write about everything. He would write about, he went to a graduation at Vassar College and described what it was like for an elite institution to graduate only women. He would describe a lynching in really powerful, unforgettable ways. He described immigrants arriving in Castle Island. So he was basically a chronicler of life in the U.S. But he wrote in Spanish, so he chronicled the U.S. for people in Latin America. And he founded a political party in favor of Cuban and Puerto Rican independence. And that was what he was most devoted to, was the independence of Cuba. And he saw and he talked about what he thought an independent Cuba would be. And he talked about that Cuba in radically egalitarian terms. So he talked about racial equality, about class equality. And he also talked about the power of the U.S. And he, in one of the last letters, in letters and in essays he published, he would talk about how the U.S. was becoming more powerful, that the U.S., he said, disdained Latin America, and that Latin America had to be careful about the U.S. extending its hold over Latin America. So he imagined Cuban independence, and he called it a revolution for the world. And I think he called it that because he thought it would bring two really important things potentially to the world. One was a model of kind of racial equality in a former slave society, and the other one was that it would serve as a check on U.S. ambitions in regard to Latin America.
Right, and he used the term kind of "our America," but it was more of kind of Latina or Spanish or even Cuban kind of perception of that, not having the U.S. And he used terms that were kind of unpleasant, like the U.S. kind of saw Cuban as kind of a victim possibly, and I think they used terms that were pretty interesting, I think, for that time.
Yeah. That essay, "Our America," is one of his most anthologized essays, one of his most famous, and it's precisely that America as a term is for North America and South America. It's the whole hemisphere, but it had, by that point, it had already come to be synonymous with the U.S. In the U.S. So he wrote this essay about our America, referring to Mexico, South America, Central America.
Right. So and so then he leaves for Cuba and becomes really kind of a national. He becomes really the national figure for revolution. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Not initially in the moment, because he dies, he's killed in battle just about 2 months after he arrives, or 3 months. But so at that point, it's not till after the war ends that he becomes, the national figure, the foremost hero of Cuba.
Right.
And he still remains that today, both in Miami and in Havana,
Right. And there was always kind of like an East-West tension in the country of Cuba. Would you agree with that? Like, you talk about this whole, this dividing fortification that they built between East-West, but there's always been some variation, like maybe the difference between Northern and Southern California.
Yeah, I think that's true. Historically, in the colonial period, Western Cuba, which includes Havana, was, the one that had the most investment economically, had the most wealth, had the most power. So there's a sense in which Havana, in particular, and the West, in places like Matanzas, et cetera, was more modernized. There was more infrastructure, et cetera. So yes, that's true. The East is more mountainous, so it never had those large modern during the colonial period. It never had those large modern sugar plantations. It had kind of smaller peasant production, smaller sugar farms, coffee, etc. So, and historically, Havana has always been more powerful than the rest of the country, right? It's been the capital, so it's enjoyed more privileges and more development than other parts of the island.
Right. And there's just so much more in your book. You talk about the Maine blows up, the war, the Spanish-American War, all the times of going up to World War II, then to Castro. It kind of even comes to the present right now. I think Raul Castro in April just decided to seat his head of the Communist Party. And you have that experience there from 1962 between Batista getting, I think it was Batista, right? He got kicked out by the communists. I mean, can you talk? We're kind of at 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Can you kind of provide a summary or what's left? What else you talk about in the book? And then,
yeah. I mean, as you can probably tell, I can talk about this stuff forever. I'll just tell. I mean, one of the things about the book covers, from before Columbus to the present, as you say. So it ends with with Raul Castro stepping down and with Biden getting elected and so on. But as it proceeds, the chapters are generally short. So there's, I hope, some kind of page turning momentum, and readers can just kind of, bite off little morsels at a time. So for example, I think the Bay of Pigs chapter will interest readers, and the missile crisis and so on. But in terms of a summary, I would just say that Fidel Castro's the revolution came to power in 1959 by deposing Batista, who had assumed power illegally. I think the most important thing to remember, and which I think may surprise some Americans, because they think of Cuba as, and they think of the revolution as Fidel Castro's communist revolution. But in the beginning, it wasn't communist. And in the beginning, he was just one leader among many. So one of the things that I try to pay attention to throughout is the way we all know what happened with Cuba. We all know that Castro is going to become really important, that the country's going to be communist, there's going to be a rift with the US and relations are going to be severed, and you're going to get things like the missile. So we all know that happens. But I try to tell it in a way that would have been experienced by people on the ground. No one in 1959, in January 59, or very few people would have imagined the outcome of all that. So I try to kind of restore some of that sense of uncertainty, of excitement, of history being made in the moment. So that's the way I write about it. The revolution does become communist. It becomes communist not as a result of one thing, but several things. One is, I think that Castro himself was predisposed and sympathetic to that ideology. One thing is that some of the goals that he began to try to meet in the beginning, things like land reform, anti-corruption, etc., those were things that were part of mainstream Cuban political discourse for a long time. And he began delivering on them. And I think he realized that as people supported those early moves. So I think he came to realize, oh, I'm popular. They like this. I can do this. And he just kept going. Because realizing that he could. It's almost like he realized, oh, I can do this, and I can do it even more, and I could do it more radically. And so he kind of took off on that path. The other thing was the miscalculation of the U.S. The U.S. was only looking at this as a question of the Cold War and what Fidel Castro was going to do vis-a-vis the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But Castro was really good at using a tradition of Cuban nationalism and a tradition of Cuban skepticism about U.S. power and about U.S. intentions on the island. And he just used that to really good effect. He said they're going to invade. And then you'd have people in Congress threatening to invade, So he used that. So he used that to really good effect. And then finally, the Cold War itself, it made it really hard for Cuba to assume a position that wasn't either, as U.S. ally or Soviet ally. It made a kind of middle position impossible. So all those things made it become a communist revolution.
Right. But it just shows, and I think that you confirmed and verified this theme of your book, how much the U.S. has influenced Cuba, and also Cuba influencing the U.S. So it's all been there for centuries. So really a great book, highly recommended. Where's the best place for people to get Cuba and American history? Well,
they can get it almost anywhere. So I would say, they could get it on Amazon. If they buy from Amazon, they could get it at an independent bookstore if that's where they buy. I have a website, adaferrer.net, where there's links to different places to buy it and more information on other work I'm doing.
Ada Ferrer. And so people can reach out to you through that
Yes.
website as well if
Absolutely.
they want to ask any questions or anything.
Yeah.
It's adaferrer.net, correct?
Yes.
I'll put that in the show notes. Okay. Again, it's Dr. Ada Ferrer, and the title of the book is Cuba, An American History, just published September 7th, 2021. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right. I did too. Take care.